War tends to be quite dangerous. Quite often during wars, people tend to get killed. Now personally, I'm a fan of not being killed, an opinion that has been shared by most people throughout most of history. And as such, one of the ways you could avoid fighting in a war is to pay someone else to go and fight for you. This was then combined with the fact that wars actually could be quite profitable, as the opposing side tended to have things of value that you could just take, and suddenly we have invented the concept of mercenaries. Soldiers that you could hire that would do the fighting for you, either for your money, or your enemy's money, or some combination of the two. Now with that, I want to quickly define what a mercenary actually is, as in the modern term, someone fighting for money technically applies to all contract soldiers, all police officers, all civilian guards like museum and shop guards, and all club bouncers. All of these people quite literally fight for money. As such, the fighting for money definition has to be kept, but we have to clarify that what makes a mercenary special is that their loyalty can be bought. Soldiers, police officers, museum guards and club bouncers are all loyal to a government or institution or even a location. With a mercenary, their loyalty lies to money. As such, a bouncer fights to keep the club safe, a soldier fights to keep his country safe, and a mercenary fights to get paid. This will be the definition they'll be working with, aka a fighter that sells military services to temporary employees without permanent allegiance to any state or institution. Now, these mercenary chaps have a very rich history and occupy a decent chunk of our cultural heritage. Indeed, one could argue that the whole genre of Dungeons and Dragons is just nerds pretending to be mercenaries, but also magic is real. With that said, Paradox games do tend to take place in history. So how do these titles represent mercenaries? Let's begin with Crusader Kings, looking at 2 and 3. But before we do jump into that, just a quick sidestep to say that a like on would be appreciated, and a subscription would be incredible. We're currently sitting at 44,500 subscribers, and I would love to hit 45k, so let's see if we can make that happen. Anyway, enough self-shitting, let's get to Crusader Kings 2 and 3 then. Within both Crusader Kings 2 and 3, the game itself has an incredibly well done representation of how armies operated within the feudal realm and time period. Indeed, when looking at other titles like Medieval 2 Total War, or say Civilization set in the medieval period, in many cases we see medieval armies modelled as modern standard armies, but knights are really strong and more expensive. Now, standing armies existed, referred to in Crusader Kings 2 as the retinue and in Crusader Kings 3 as the men-at-arms, both frankly valid terms to use in my opinion, but the bulk of most forces were levied troops that were well levied by their local knights, counts and dukes when called upon by their king or feudal liege lord. This of course made the matter of gathering an army an absolute nightmare of maintaining feudal relationships, privileges and obligations, and in many cases being done on a who-knows-who basis, a system that the vast majority of games set during the time period ignore to their detriment. Crusader Kings 2 and 3 don't. You can change levy contracts to negotiate what percentage of troops your levy sends to your side, and your vassals frequently, for lack of a better word, commit acts of treason by not doing so. And into that system we have mercenaries. See, during the medieval period, the national treasury was better described as a personal bank account of the monarch, and with taxation being a thing that the richer you got, the more exempt from you became, getting money for the crown remained an issue. But legally, owning a country is still a very profitable endeavour, and hence mercenaries were frequently employed to both bolster ranks of existing armies, to straight up go on entire war campaigns and man entire fronts with mercenaries alone. I'm looking at you, Italian city-states. And this is well represented in Crusader Kings 2 and 3. Mercs exist, are strong and expensive, and can be relied upon to give you a couple thousand extra men in times of need. The issue for me is how Crusader Kings 2 and Crusader Kings 3 scale far too quickly. Crusader Kings 3 especially, meaning you very quickly hit the point where everyone is walking around with downright unrealistic 20k army stacks. Remember, medieval armies were Henry John and his mate Fred popping over for a quick campaign. The famous Battle of Agincourt, for example, was 6 to 8k British men taking a stab at 14 to 15k French, or basically 2 Irish OPMs fighting in 12th century CK3 Ireland. This unnatural scaling of army sizes diminishing the relative historical relevancy of a couple thousand men showing up as a mercenary army. Another big issue is retinue was already quite easy to get in Crusader Kings 2, but by the time you get to Crusader Kings 3, men-at-arms are insanely strong and frankly way too cheap, and easy to get a lot of, meaning that 11th century tribal Ireland is able to field 16th and 17th century standing armies. I understand that having strong men-at-arms is fun. To a certain extent, I have to say I do enjoy the Crusader Kings 3 war system, but it does again diminish the impact of mercenary companies from a gameplay point of view. With that all said, they are all certainly very present and very well implemented, with unique local bonuses and drawbacks, differences in army composition and even mechanics about mercenary payments. And indeed I would say Paradox here went above and beyond with the Wanderer DLC, which personally I think is the masterclass of what a good DLC expansion should be, by adding the option to found a mercenary camp yourself and play as one. It's a very cool unique gameplay and unironically stands as an excellent representation of mercenaries during the time period. As such, Crusader Kings has earned this thumbs up. A lot of cool mercenary stuff happened in this time period, and if it wasn't for the power creep, it would basically be a perfect system in my opinion. But with that praise all said and done, let's move on to Europa Universalis 4. The thing with EU4 is that outside of Ethiopia getting a levy-esque mechanic within their cover units, in truth, the EU4 warfare, where you have a large centralized standing armies, only really happened from the 17th and 18th centuries, and culminated with Napoleon doing a Napoleon. But it would be just downright stupid to claim we had massive standing armies in the 15th and 16th centuries. Well, not to the massive extent that they are present in the game. Let's remember that Prussia became the super-militarized state that was able to fight on par with Austria and the French because Prussia had this huge standing army, which was all full-time trained soldiers. This army? To be absolutely clear, 20,000 men in that time period was an insane amount of troops for Prussia to field as a full-time professional military, especially given their size. But considering France in 1444 quite literally starts with a larger standing army of professional full-time men than that, no. Ironically, for the sake of historical accuracy, at least within the domain of Europe, making every 1k men stack into 100 men, and turning every cannon 1k stack into 1 cannon would be far more accurate, as indeed, looking at historical sources, field artillery was basically non-existent, and cannons were almost exclusively siege artillery, counted individually and frequently captured and changed hands. Now, we did get sidetracked from mercenaries, but that's to say that EU4 has a similar problem to CK2 and CK3. Conventional armed forces became too professional too fast, and while the 14th and 15th centuries saw the collapse of feudalism as a structure of states, with increased centralization culminating in revolution, enlightened absolutism, and all the developments ranging from nationalism to humanism, well, EU4 just kind of backports 17th and 18th century political developments to the 15th century, sometimes to great detriment. France went between having vassals to not having vassals to back to having vassals, simply because EU4 fails to portray the fact that in 1444, France, and frankly by extent England, were still very much just playing Crusader Kings 3, and while the men-at-arms regiments were larger, they were not exactly the main standing army. As such, mercenaries, in, for lack of a better word, the golden age of mercenaries, are delved to a side mechanic. What do I mean by side mechanic? Well, let's take a look at one of my favourite one-off campaigns that you can do in EU4, a Pirate Republic. You sit around on islands with one big navy, stealing treasure fleets, looting coasts, and raiding everyone and anyone. It's neat, and you can present a unique way of playing a game, and while it certainly can be repeated, most nations don't usually play around with piracy mechanics at all. Another slightly more tryhard example would be making a build around vassal annexation cost. You never take land directly and hence never get overextension, bypassing that whole issue, but you annex your vassals for super cheap, like 90% off, and hence you expand through vassals and annexation. It's a fun and perfectly valid way to play the game, and indeed in quite a few campaigns you'll probably grab a few vassals here and there, but you rarely fully employ them despite the mechanic existing. And this is the state of mercenaries in EU4. We have game mechanics for famous mercenary companies like the German Landsknechts or the Italian Condottieri. They exist and are implemented frankly quite well. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that it is optimal to hire the free company, as they are so cheap, and a nation like Switzerland is more than capable of doing a mercenary build for the entire campaign. And yet, with all that said, mercenaries that during this period historically would change the tide of battle and be involved in everything ranging from small European arguments to the American War of Independence, well, are just not really a system you tend to engage with as much as you really should. I don't think the system is inherently bad, you certainly can engage with the system as said before, but the best way of summarizing it is disappointing. The choices made for modeling warfare as a whole mean that mercenaries are relegated to a secondary role during the entire game, which frankly is quite frustrating. Not quite Victoria 3 levels of frustrating though. Indeed, it's not the only thing that's frustrating. Have you ever felt like the internet was designed to frustrate you? You're ready to binge that one shows everyone's talking about, but nope, geo-blocked. Or you're working at your favorite coffee shop and suddenly wonder if someone's stealing your data. Well, fear not. Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark, the ultimate tool to make your internet safer and smarter. A VPN, or virtual private network, protects your data by encrypting it and hiding your location. It's like putting your online activity in a secure vault away from hackers, snoopers, and even annoying pop-ups. And with Surfshark, it's easy, reliable, and packed with features. Here's Game Changer. With Surfshark, you can access content from around the world. Want to dive into the extensive British nature documentary library on Netflix, but find yourself outside the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom? Surfshark breaks down borders and lets you watch what you want wherever you want. It's like having a passport for your streaming apps. Ever use public Wi-Fi or any network where you are not the system admin and don't see who is connected and where? Well, those unprotected networks can be intercepted by hackers. Surfshark encrypts your connection so you can browse, shop, and send emails without worrying about cyber snoopers stealing your data. One of my favorite things about Surfshark is how you can connect unlimited devices with a single account. Your phone, laptop, tablet, even your smart toaster, if you're fancy like that, can all be protected. Everyone in your household gets covered, no questions asked. And here's a bonus, Surfshark isn't just a VPN, it also offers Surfshark Antivirus. This powerful tool defends your devices from viruses, malware, and other online threats. It's like having an extra layer of armor for your tech. Ready to upgrade your internet experience? Visit surfshark.com/lemoncake to get 4 extra months free on your 2-year plan, and that's security, privacy, and savings all backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee. Surfshark, smarter, safer internet at your fingertips. Well, with that little intermission out of the way, let's talk about mercenaries in Victoria 3. And that is to say that while by the Victoria III period, armies certainly hit the professional standing army point that we come to understand, foreign legions being deployed for monetary purposes still very much occurred. As an example, British veterans that fought against Napoleon found themselves a touch unemployed when France entered their post-Napoleon administration. At the same time, these British soldiers had extensive experience fighting, among all else, specifically Spanish troops during the British campaigns in Iberia, for example. This meant that when Simon Bolivar needed troops to help fight the Spanish, and had money to offer, well, British soldiers certainly found their ways into those ranks, in quite a number, and to such an extent that during the First Carlist War, the British government would go ahead and suspend the Foreign Enlistment Act, which would allow the recruitment of practically official British auxiliary legions. Now, some soldiers were certainly idealists and went over to fight for freedom, I don't deny it, but it would be delusional to say that all of these men were ideologically committed to freedom, considering the non-trivial amount of those soldiers that were ideologically committed to the generous salaries being offered for those positions. It's a bit like applying for a job as an accountancy consultant. Yes, you're doing it for the money, but if anyone asks you are passionate about identifying discrepancies in SEC filing FT6455497J concerning certifications of change in definitive material deployment. And indeed, before you ask, that is a real filing, you are free to look it up, but something tells me you won't. My point though is that mercenaries were still very much deployed, and the fact that their salaries were paid for by the Colombian government and not by the government of Britain lets me class them as such. Indeed, while they were certainly on the decline, mercenaries still very much existed during this time period. So how are they presented in Victoria III? Yet they don't exist. Like at all, you can't hire mercenaries. In fact, I was actually quite worried I missed some major game mechanic here. It wouldn't be the first time, so I reached out to a professional Victoria III gamer, and he indeed confirmed the lack of mercenaries in Victoria III. Now, to be clear, when I say this is the top priority of Victoria III, no. Personally, I would prefer a system where when units arrived on the front line, they didn't enter a quantum superposition, meaning that we will also avoid all the issues that occur when your army happens to only have a 20% chance of being where you actually need them to be. With that said, I have heard the phrase that if you have nothing nice to say, you should say nothing at all. Meaning that this does unfortunately conclude the Victoria III section, and we move to Hearts of Iron 4. The changing nature of warfare at this point has certainly eliminated the need for mercenaries, or guns for hire, I guess, would be a more appropriate statement at this point. Possible examples of this time period would be things like the Flying Tigers, which were an American mercenary group, perhaps, that was deployed to China with the intent to fight the Japanese there. They would end up performing very well during this deployment, until eventually on the 4th of July they would be formally disbanded and replaced by the 23rd Fighter Group. Now, they would earn triple the salary of other American service personnel in similar roles, so there was a monetary incentive, but it was more of a glorified foreign deployment as the American government was the one paying these salaries and not the Chinese. Hence it would be dishonest to call them a mercenary group, and as such it's more adequate to refer to them as combat volunteers. With that said, they are actually represented within Hearts of Iron 4, as they are mentioned within specific focuses. Furthermore, within the Hearts of Iron 4 period, it can be argued that foreign volunteers would replace the traditional mercenary, which I would personally consider a simplification, but a reasonable one. And here I have to concede to Hearts of Iron 4, outside of random instances that when a country's at war, volunteers have to be withdrawn, I think the volunteer system is more than adequate, as well as the fact that even more obscure deployments like the aforementioned Flying Tigers are still reflected in the game. To be clear, mercenaries are, if not basically gone during this time period, very much on their way out, but even with that said, it's still modelled quite well within the existing focuses or volunteer system, and hence I commend Paradox on this one. But with that praise aside, let's get to the final chapter of today's topic, Stellaris. Now, a certain trend I want to mention is that the equipment necessary to wage war tends to get more expensive over time. Back in the Stone Age, you could get away with a pointy stick. By the early classical period, you better have some helmets, shields, and swords. When we hit the Middle Ages, mercenaries are running around with fancy mail armor and breastplates and swords, halberds, and all those other kind of stuff. In the early modern period, we have gunpowder weapons with even fancier armor to boot, including of course all your ammunition. The issue, of course, is that while guns are more expensive than swords, and swords are more expensive than pointy sticks from both a resource and human labor kind of view, they are still affordable for the individual. But by World War II, wars are now being fought with artillery, tanks, and flying horses known as airplanes, which even if the individual could afford to get one through saving up their life salary, well, artillery needs shells, tanks need whole crews to maintain and repair them, and planes famously use a lot of fuel to do all that whole flying thing. Basically, modern industrial wars are expensive, which is arguably a big factor that hinders mercenary operations. Naturally, you can still be effective today with basically an assault rifle and a dream, but to effectively participate in modern wars between industrialized nations, well, you kinda need your own small industrial base in the garden. The reason I bring this up, specifically inside the Stellaris section though, is that now wars are taking place in space. Spaceships are like the opposite of cheap, and we aren't exactly launching Stellaris-sized battleships into orbit or anything crazy. We're currently launching the military equivalent of a raft into orbit. My main point is that while it's kind of impossible to talk about the feasibility of technology that hasn't happened yet, after all I don't know what will be invented in the future, I still believe it's a reasonable assumption that space warships will be completely unaffordable for private military companies, considering private military companies today aren't anywhere close to affording the more expensive Earth-based weaponry systems, like intercontinental ballistic missiles, aircraft carriers, or stealth bombers. However, Stellaris can pretty confidently hide behind the rule of cool, and hence the wannabe Mongol Khans can quite literally be hired as mercenaries. In my opinion, they work as a fun little side piece of content in a rather inoffensive way, and I believe that compared to a lot of other downright ludicrous things Stellaris has in terms of their sci-fi, well, mercenary space fighters are well within the realm of believability. I believe they certainly work as a side piece level of content, and to be honest, I don't think they need to be expanded any more than that. With that said, that is going to be all the time I have for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to my channel members, especially Ark, Soda, W Haste, Selemon, Star72, Lord Zendikar, Nick Fastbender, Nanhatan, Nick Huss, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Pro Gaming, Granville Flavian, Conno, Andreas Salberg, Decky, Sov, Mobkiller, Anthony35, AC Naipo, Glorious Leader, and Zerkis.